Jake Miller was a 42-year-old Army veteran who had spent the last 2 decades serving his country, from deployments in the Middle East to training recruits stateside. After retiring with an honorable discharge, he wanted a quiet life, a place to call his own away from the noise of cities and the weight of his past. He'd saved for years and finally found a perfect spot, a modest cabin in Timberlake, a small, gated community nestled in the hills of northern Georgia. The cabin was nothing fancy, a single-story, 2-bedroom home with a wraparound porch, surrounded by pines and a gravel driveway. To Jake, it was perfect. He closed on the property in early June, and by mid-July, he was ready to move in. Timberlake was governed by a homeowners association, known for its strict rules and vigilant oversight. The HOA president, Linda Grayson, was a retired accountant in her 60s who ran the community like a personal fiefdom. Linda was known for her hawk-like attention to detail. Mailboxes had to be a specific shade of black, lawns couldn't exceed 3 inches in height, and any exterior changes required her approval. Jake had heard about her reputation when he bought the cabin, but he wasn't worried. He'd dealt with stricter chains of command in the military. All he wanted was to settle in, maybe plant a garden, and enjoy the solitude. Jake arrived at Timberlake on a humid Saturday morning, his pickup truck loaded with boxes, a few pieces of furniture, and his old Army duffel. The cabin had been vacant for months, and the previous owner, an elderly man, had moved to Florida. Jake had all the paperwork, deed, title, and closing documents, neatly organized in a folder. He'd even notified the HOA of his move-in date, as required, though he hadn't received a response. As he unloaded boxes onto the porch, he noticed a woman watching him from across the street. It was Linda, her arms crossed, a phone pressed her ear. Jake waved, but she didn't wave back. He shrugged it off and kept working. What Jake didn't know was that Linda had been skeptical about him from the moment she heard about the sale. The previous owner hadn't been active in the community, and Linda had assumed the cabin would go to someone she'd personally vetted. She'd never met Jake, but his military surplus truck, weathered boots, and the fact that he was moving in alone raised her suspicions. To her, he didn't look like he fit Timberlake's image. When she saw him unloading boxes, she didn't bother checking the HOA records or asking him for proof of ownership. Instead, she dialed 911. "This is Linda Grayson, president of the Timberlake HOA," she told the dispatcher. "There's a man trespassing on a property at 142 Pine Road. He's unloading things from a truck, and I don't recognize him. He's not supposed to be here. Send someone immediately." The dispatcher asked a few questions, but Linda was insistent, claiming the community's safety was at stake. She hung up, confident the police would handle it. Jake was carrying a box of kitchen supplies when 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up, their cruiser's lights flashing. He set the box down and wiped sweat from his brow, assuming they were just patrolling. The deputies, Officers Daniels and Perez, stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts. "Sir, we got a call about a possible trespasser," Daniels said, his tone calm but professional. "Mind telling us who you are and what you're doing here?" Jake was confused but stayed composed. He'd been in enough high-stress situations to know panic wouldn't help. "I'm Jake Miller," he said. "I own this cabin. Just closed on it last month. I'm moving in today." He reached into his truck and pulled out the folder with his documents, handing it to Daniels. "Everything's in there, deed, title, even my HOA paperwork." Daniels flipped through the papers while Perez glanced at the cabin, and then at Linda, who was now standing at the edge of Jake's driveway, watching with a smug expression. The documents checked out. The deed was in Jake's name, signed and notarized. Daniels handed the folder back. "Looks good, Mr. Miller. Welcome to the neighborhood." But then he paused, squinting at Jake. "Hang on. You're not Sergeant Major Miller, are you? From Fort Benning?" Jake nodded, a bit surprised. "Yeah, that's me. Retired last year." Daniels broke into a grin. "Man, I was in your last training cohort before you left. You probably don't remember me, but you were a legend. That obstacle course drill you ran us through? Brutal." Perez, who'd served a shorter stint in the National Guard, chimed in. "Heard about you, too. My CO said you were the real deal." Both deputies straightened up, and Daniels offered a crisp salute. Honor to meet you, Sergeant Major. Jake returned the salute, a bit embarrassed by the attention. Just Jake now, he said. Appreciate it, though. The deputy shook his hand, and Perez added, If you need anything settling in, let us know. We got your back. They turned to leave, but not before Daniels glanced at Linda, who was now frozen in place, her phone still in hand. Ma'am, Daniels called out to her, this man's a rightful owner. False 911 calls tie up resources. I'd recommend verify your facts next time. Linda's face flushed red. She muttered something about a misunderstanding and hurried back to her house, leaving Jake and the deputies exchanging amused looks. The incident didn't end there, though. Word spread fast in Timberlake, and by evening, neighbors were stopping by to introduce themselves. Some apologized for Linda's actions, explaining she'd been overzealous ever since taking over the HOA. A few had their own stories of her nitpicking. Fines for unapproved flower beds, warnings about unauthorized birdhouses. Jake listened politely, keeping his thoughts to himself. He wasn't here to stir trouble. He just wanted to live in peace. But Linda wasn't done. The next morning, Jake found a notice taped to his door, citing unauthorized vehicle parking for his truck in the driveway. He sighed, recognizing her handwriting. He'd already checked the HOA rules. Driveway parking was allowed as long as the vehicle was operational and registered, which his truck was. He ignored the notice and went about unpacking, but Linda's campaign continued. Over the next week, she sent 3 more notices, one for excessive noise from his moving boxes. He hadn't even used power tools. Another for unapproved exterior modifications. He'd hung a small American flag on the porch. And a third demanding he attend an HOA meeting to discuss compliance. Jake decided to attend the meeting, held at the community clubhouse the following Tuesday. He walked in, still in his work boots and a faded Army t-shirt, carrying his folder of documents. Linda presided at the front, flanked by 2 other board members who looked uncomfortable. The room was filled with about 20 residents, some curious, others clearly there to see Linda in action. She started by addressing Jake directly, her voice dripping with authority. Mr. Miller, your presence in Timberlake has already caused disruption. We have standards here, and your failure to comply with basic rules. Parking, noise, and unapproved decorations suggest you're not a good fit. Jake stayed calm, standing to respond. Ma'am, I've read the HOA bylaws. My truck's registered and parked legally. I haven't made noise beyond carrying boxes, and the flag on my porch is within my rights as a homeowner. I have the deed to my property, and I notified the HOA of my move-in. If there's an issue, I'd like to hear specifics. He set his folder on the table, open to the relevant pages. The room went quiet. Linda's face tightened, but she pressed on, claiming his flag was too large and his truck lowered property values. That's when another resident, an older man named Tom who'd lived in Timberlake for a decade, stood up. Linda, enough. This man's a veteran who bought his home fair and square. You called the cops on him for no reason, and now you're harassing him over a flag? We're not your personal kingdom. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another neighbor, a woman named Sarah, added, My son's in the Army. That flag's a symbol of service. You should be ashamed. Linda tried to regain control, but the mood had shifted. The other board members, sensing the tide turning, suggested tabling the discussion. By the end of the meeting, a motion was proposed to review Linda's actions as president, with several residents calling for her resignation. Jake didn't say much more, but he left the clubhouse with a few new allies, including Tom, who invited him over for a beer later that week. The sheriff department, meanwhile, had filed a report about Linda's 911 call. False emergency reports weren't taken lightly, and while they didn't press charges, they issued her a formal warning. The embarrassment was enough to make Linda scale back her HOA activities. She stopped sending notices to Jake, and her presence at community events dwindled. By the next month, she'd stepped down as president, citing personal reasons. A new president, a retired schoolteacher named Ellen, took over, promising a more collaborative approach. Jake settled into his cabin, planting a small garden and adding a rocking chair to the porch. The flag stayed up and no one complained. Neighbors started waving when they passed by, and some even stopped to chat about his time in the Army or share tips about the best fishing spots nearby. The deputies, Daniels and Perez, dropped by once to check in, bringing a six-pack as a housewarming gift. They laughed about the 911 call, and Daniels admitted they'd spread the story around the station, turning Jake into a minor legend. The Timberlake HOA never fully shook its reputation for being overzealous, but under Ellen's leadership, it focused on practical matters like road maintenance and community picnics. Jake attended a few events, always keeping to himself, but appreciating the sense of community. He never brought up the 911 incident again, but it lingered in the neighborhood's memory, a reminder that even the most controlling figures could misjudge their target. For Jake, the cabin became what he'd always hoped, a place to find peace. He'd wake up to the sound of birds, not sirens, and spend evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the pines. The HOA's attempt to stop him had backfired, and in its place, he'd found respect, not just from the cops who saluted him, but from a community that learned to value a man who'd earned his place the hard way.